Picture this. A man sits alone at a reserved table in a quiet restaurant, checking his watch for the 7th time that month, bracing himself for another blind date he already expects to disappoint him. Then the door swings open, and a woman he has never seen before walks straight toward his table, sits down across from him without asking, and whispers 5 words that will change the next year of his life. "Please, pretend you know me." He had no idea that saying yes to a frightened stranger would end up teaching him more about honesty than anything his money had ever bought him. What he couldn't possibly know was that the woman sitting across from him wasn't just running from danger. She was carrying a secret that would soon force him to question the people he trusted most. But before we tell you why a stranger chose Brian's table instead of anyone else's, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Brian Vale was 38 years old, and on paper, his life looked complete. He ran Vale International, a company his father had started and Brian had spent 15 years growing into something far bigger. He worked long hours because the alternative, sitting still, made him uneasy in a way he never fully explained to anyone. Most nights, dinner was whatever happened to be sitting on his desk while he answered emails long after everyone else had gone home. He wasn't cold, exactly, just guarded, the kind of guarded that comes from watching people smile at you and wonder, underneath it, what they might be able to get. His father had died when Brian was 17, and in the years after, he had learned to read a balance sheet long before he learned how to sit with another person in comfortable silence. His mother, Helen, was the one person who never wanted anything from him except his time. She had been sick for almost a year, managing it quietly, refusing to let it slow down her habit of worrying about her son more than herself. One evening, sitting across from him at her kitchen table, she told him she wasn't afraid of what was coming. She was afraid of what would happen to him afterward, alone in a house full of things and empty of people. She asked him to try, really try, to meet someone. Not through the company, not through introductions arranged by business partners, but through 10 actual dates, one at a time. Brian agreed, mostly because refusing her felt unthinkable, and partly because some small part of him wondered if she might be right. The first 6 dates went about how he expected. One woman spent 40 minutes describing a handbag collection he hadn't asked about. Another asked, almost as a greeting, how many properties he owned. A third admitted, halfway through dessert, that she had researched his net worth the night before, as though it were a normal thing to say out loud. By the 6th date, a woman looked at him across the table and said she had always pictured herself with someone like him, and when he asked what she meant by someone like him, she answered simply, someone rich. He paid the bill, drove home, and sat in his car outside his own house for a long time before going inside. He had started to believe his mother's hope was a kind one, but an unrealistic one. The 7th date was scheduled at a small Italian restaurant near the edge of downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and quiet conversation, not the kind of place built to impress anyone. Brian arrived early out of habit and sat facing the door, already rehearsing the polite excuses he would use to leave early if the evening went the way the last 6 had gone. At 7:18, the door opened, and a woman walked in fast, breathing hard, glancing behind her before the door had even swung shut. She almost slipped on the polished floor near the entrance, caught herself against the back of a chair, and glanced nervously toward the door one more time before scanning the room. For a brief second, Brian wondered whether she had mistaken him for someone else entirely. Then, without hesitation, she walked straight toward his table and sat down across from him like they had done this 100 times before. The woman would later introduce herself as Ivory Shawn, but in this first moment, Brian only knew that up close. Her hands were trembling slightly around the edge of the table. She kept her voice low, almost pleading, and said only that she needed him to pretend he knew her, just for a few minutes. She wasn't ready to explain why yet, only that she believed someone out there already knew she had heard something she wasn't supposed to hear, and that it wasn't safe to say more out loud. Not here, not yet. Every instinct built over 15 years of protecting himself told him to ask her to leave. Instead, he found himself sliding the extra water glass toward her and saying, quietly, "Okay." Just breathe. I've got you." He didn't know why he said it, but something in the way she gripped the edge of the table reminded him of every version of fear he had spent years learning to hide. Two men appeared near the restaurant's front window less than a minute later, scanning the room through the glass, moving slowly from table to table. One of them stopped directly outside the window and looked in, his eyes drifting across the room with unsettling patience. For one uncomfortable second, Brian was certain the man was about to walk through the door, and he felt Ivory's hand tighten around the edge of the table without either of them saying a word. Then the man said something to the other, glanced once more toward the back of the restaurant, and finally turned and continued down the street. Ivory didn't move until they were both completely out of sight, and only then did she let out a breath she had clearly been holding the entire time. Brian watched her hands slowly unclench from the table, and it occurred to him that in 6 previous dates, no one had ever looked this unguarded in front of him, this obviously human. She still wouldn't explain everything. She told him only that it involved her job, and that she had seen something in a place she wasn't supposed to be standing, at a moment she wasn't supposed to be listening. She asked him not to push, not tonight, and Brian, surprising himself, agreed. Whatever she was running from, it wasn't him, and it clearly wasn't his money, and that alone made her the first person all year who had genuinely surprised him. Before she left that night, she agreed to see him again, mostly, she admitted, because she didn't want to walk home wondering if those men were still out there somewhere on the same street. They met again 3 days later, this time at a quiet coffee shop near her apartment, somewhere she felt steadier, somewhere with an exit she had already mapped out in her mind before he arrived. Brian noticed she had chosen the seat facing both the entrance and the exit, and said nothing about it, though it told him more clearly than words how far from safe she still felt. It was there that Ivory finally told him the rest. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small property management firm 2 blocks from the restaurant. A few nights earlier, while finishing paperwork after hours, she had overheard her supervisor on a phone call, arguing with someone about money that had quietly gone missing from several client accounts over recent months. She hadn't meant to hear it. She had simply been photocopying invoices in the next room when the door was left open wider than it should have been, and her supervisor's raised voice carried further than he realized. Her supervisor caught her expression in the hallway right as the call ended, and something in his face told her immediately that he knew she had heard too much. She didn't wait around to find out what he planned to do about it. She grabbed her coat and left, walking fast, then faster, until she ducked into the first restaurant she saw with enough people inside to feel safe, and the first face that looked steady enough to trust, for reasons she still couldn't fully explain, belonged to a stranger sitting alone at a reserved table. Brian asked her the obvious question. Why not call the police immediately? Ivory admitted she had considered it, but she wasn't fully certain what she had actually heard was enough to prove anything. I think I may have enough to show something was wrong, she told him, if I'm right about what it means. Brian didn't know that before leaving the office that night, Ivory had quietly slipped copies of several financial records into her bag. Even she wasn't sure whether they would matter, or whether she was overreacting to a conversation she had only caught in pieces. Brian didn't push her to decide right away. He simply told her to take her time, that he wasn't going anywhere, and something about the plainness of his voice seemed to steady her more than any promise could have. Over the following weeks, Brian and Ivory kept meeting, and the reason for it slowly stopped being about the men outside the restaurant window at all. He found himself checking his phone more than he had in years, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to curiosity about another person's day. Ivory, meanwhile, was still turning her decision over in her mind, still unsure whether reporting her supervisor would protect her or put her further in danger, still asking Brian questions he didn't fully know how to answer. Neither of them was in a rush to define exactly what they were becoming to each other. They simply kept showing up, one coffee, one dinner, one quiet conversation at a time. It was Brian, eventually, who gently pushed her toward a decision, not by telling her what to do, but by reminding her that staying silent wouldn't make the fear disappear, it would only stretch it out longer. Ivory finally gathered the courage, along with the documents she had quietly kept copies of, and reported what she had heard to the proper authorities. Her instincts turned out to be correct. It wasn't a stranger inside her firm siphoning money from client accounts. It was someone senior enough to have access and enough trust that no one had thought to double-check his numbers in over a year. What neither of them expected was how closely the case would circle back to Brian's own company. Vale International managed several accounts through the same property firm where Ivory worked, and once investigators started tracing the missing funds, Brian's own finance team flagged irregularities that matched the pattern almost exactly. It meant the theft Ivory had accidentally overheard wasn't an isolated incident at her small firm. It was connected to someone inside Brian's own organization, someone he had trusted enough to never look twice at the numbers they signed off on each quarter. Brian faced a decision that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with character. He could quietly distance the company from the investigation, protect Vale International's reputation, and let Ivory's testimony stand alone without his backing. Or he could publicly support the investigation, hand over his own company's records, and risk headlines that would follow him for years regardless of the outcome. He thought about his mother, about the difference between inheriting a company and inheriting the kind of person his father actually was underneath it. He chose to open the books. For weeks after that, the outcome was far from certain. Newspapers speculated about how far the fraud actually reached. Employees whispered in hallways, unsure who else might be involved. Investors demanded answers Brian didn't yet have, and even he wasn't fully certain how much damage would eventually be uncovered once investigators finished going through years of records. Ivory watched from a distance, worried that her decision to speak up had set off something far bigger than either of them had expected, and more than once she asked Brian if he regretted supporting her. He never once said yes. The case took 4 months to fully resolve. The executive responsible pleaded guilty rather than face a public trial, and Vale International's cooperation, rather than damaging the company's reputation, ended up strengthening it. Ivory kept her job at the property firm, though she eventually moved to a different office across town, and slowly stopped flinching every time a door opened faster than expected. Brian noticed the change in her before she noticed it in herself, the way her shoulders started sitting lower, the way her laugh stopped catching halfway through. He realized, somewhere in those 4 months, that he had stopped eating dinner alone at his desk most nights, and he hadn't even noticed exactly when that had changed. Helen passed away 6 weeks before the case officially closed, but she lived long enough to meet Ivory twice, and long enough to watch her son sit at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening instead of taking a call from the office. The last real conversation she had with him, she told him she had never actually wanted him to find the perfect woman. She had wanted him to find someone who reminded him he was allowed to be a person first and a businessman second. Brian held on to that sentence longer than almost anything else she ever said to him. A year after that first night at the small Italian restaurant, Brian and Ivory still went back to the same table whenever they could, half joking that it belonged to them now. He liked to remind people that the woman he was originally supposed to meet that night never actually showed up at all, and that the version of the evening he ended up living turned out to matter far more than the one that had been planned. What stayed with him longest wasn't the fraud case, or the fear in Ivory's eyes that first night, or even the fact that 2 strangers built something real out of one frightening evening. It was the choice he made in the first 10 seconds, before he knew her name, before he had any real reason to trust her at all. He chose to help a frightened stranger instead of protecting his own comfort. If a complete stranger sat across from you and asked you to pretend you knew them, what would you honestly do? Would you trust your instincts, or would you walk away? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your answer. And if this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about the strangers who have quietly shaped your own life without ever meaning to, share it with someone who needs the reminder that kindness still matters more than money ever will. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the biggest changes in life begin with 5 simple words. Please, pretend you know me. We'll see you in the next story.